If you're interested in using cover crops for forage, you're in the right place. If you're not, you might want to leave so you don't get bored. I'm just kidding. All right, so I'm going to talk today about several SARE projects that we've had over the years looking at using cover crops for forage. And honestly, if you have questions, it spurs something, go ahead and throw it out there and we'll talk about that. If I don't get through all of what I have on these slides, that'll be a win because that means that I'm answering the questions that are important to you. So I'm going to talk about several different projects, but I'm going to kind of walk you through the story of how they developed and why we asked the questions we did. But one of the great things that I found about SARE is the opportunity to take questions that producers have and to then be able to go and do the research. And frankly, I don't know how many times I get asked questions and I'm like, I don't know the answer. And it's really fun when I get to then try to figure out what the answer is. That's why I love my job. So as a scientist, I can try to do some of that. So to put it in perspective, the first kind of discussion about cover crops I want to really dive into is using late summer planted cool seasons. So if you were in the session before mine, they were really talking about double cropping and planting mostly warm seasons as potential feed resources, either as grain or as a forage resource. And in this case, I'm really talking about maybe just a bit later planting, so August kind of time frame, which for people who are producing wheat, it may still fit if they're trying to bale straw and then put on manure, which a lot of times wheat in the system, it's a good opportunity for them to be able to put manure in, but it starts delaying planting of that next crop. And so the cool seasons actually work a little bit better if we get into that mid-August time frame. Otherwise, if you can get it in early, those warm seasons, boy, they'll out-yield cool seasons any day of the week. The other thing is these late summer planted cool season species like oats are going to be really high quality with that time. So the feed value can be very, very high. In fact, we've been grazing lactating cows that are being bred on late summer planted oats, getting phenomenal breed up. In fact, there's only one problem with it, and that is we've, for some reason, got increased twinning rates on the late summer planted oats. We haven't quite figured out what that is. It may be something to do with some estrogen compounds, but we've been getting like on average 10% twins in that system, which is kind of neat. But I'm going to focus mostly on oats and then brassicas. That's where we had really started our research. And I'll kind of explain a little bit why that is. But as we look at the oats and brassicas after, this one was planted after wheat again, as I kind of mentioned before, what we see is that the quality can be quite high. And in particular, point out the crude protein of the brassicas, so radishes. This is a daikon oilseed radish and a purple top turnip. We're looking at somewhere around 24% crude protein in the leaves of those brassicas. That's as good as alfalfa, right? Very good alfalfa. Not most alfalfa hays. And then the oats are going to be a bit lower. They're only about 10% crude protein. But then look at the TDN values. The TDN of those brassicas are in the range of corn silage. Very high as well. So brassicas with some oats, a great feed resource. Now, why do I have oats in there? If you look at the brassicas, they have very high sulfur. They also have quite low fiber content. And so we need some fiber in the diet. So adding some oats into that can be really, really helpful in terms of ruminant digestion. So for the cattle feed, we want something else to balance. Now, some of you may have thinking about seed corn systems, and you see they put out brassicas and only brassicas. But then if you watch, the cattle eat a lot of the corn stalks or the corn residues out there. So they are kind of helping balance themselves out a bit. In a system where maybe you don't have a lot of residue, adding oats makes a lot of sense. So the quality is quite high, as I mentioned. And one of the first observations I made that if I'd given you a hypothesis and told you what I thought was going to happen, I would have been wrong, is that despite it looking quite horrible after the frost, you'll see December 9th here, it looks all brown. It looks like it surely deteriorated. And in fact, it'll melt down. It looks like there's nothing left because those oats and the brassicas don't have a lot of lignin. So lignin's like the woody material that helps provide structure, but it also lowers quality, and the fact that we don't have it's a good thing. It just means that looks can be deceiving. The quality remains quite high. We keep the crude protein, so we keep all that nitrogen. We do lose a little bit of energy, and in this case, we're going from actually better than corn, good corn silage to something that's more like drought-stressed corn silage, but better than any hay you'll have. So still quite high quality. Now if we look at how calves will perform on that, because it's high quality, you really want an animal that has a higher requirement. Lactating cows works well. Growing calves, developing heifers, another opportunity here to use this feed resource. So I guess I didn't really discuss it at the beginning, but the thought process was that we have the opportunity here to make the cover crops provide some short-term economic incentive by using it as a forage resource while retaining most of the soil benefits. A lot of the early work I did was looking at the soil impacts of grazing, and we really don't see a lot of negatives. We can talk a little bit more about that if you guys want to. But most of the work we've been doing is really trying to figure out how do we get these to be economically viable and maybe even profitable. And so using growing calves, we can make it work fairly well. Now you'll see I have 8 different trials on here. The reason I just put them all on, I just really wanted you to see kind of the variation in response we get in average daily gain. We get somewhere between 1.3 and 2 pound a day gain. And that variation has everything to do with the weather. We didn't really see, and in these trials, we can't compare directly across the mixes because they're all different fields, all different cattle, all different locations. But I really just wanted to point out that in some years, we do not get very good performance. 1.3 is still good for a developing heifer. But when we compare it to 2 pounds, we're like a little disappointed. The thing is that 2015 happened to be a super wet year. We had 6 different precipitation events while those calves were out there. So they just had wet hair coats, and they used a lot of energy just to maintain their body temperatures. And that's why we get a little bit lower performance. Regardless, it still looks pretty decent. So one of the questions we had was, does adding a brassica improve the performance of those calves versus the oats alone? When we started out, we were using quite a bit of brassica. And one of the things I noticed as well is, has anybody grazed a mix that has brassica in it? Has turnips or... So when they graze, what do? They do get loose. That's because it doesn't have much fiber. They also tend to eat the leaves off. They eat all the grass if it's out there. And then if you leave them, they'll start eating the bulbs. Well, I didn't really like that because I wanted to have ground cover. So I wanted to maintain some ground cover, and I still wanted to be able to use as much of the brassica as I could, because the way I saw it was when you have those bulbs out there, and particularly like purple top turnip, it can put as much as 40 to 60% of its energy into that bulb. I don't want to lose all of that feed. So we started using rapeseed because it was cheap. It doesn't produce a bulb. It actually produces a taproot, which is actually good for compaction. And then I can manage my grazing a little bit better, forcing them to eat the leaf and the oats, for instance, and still maintaining good ground cover. So rapeseed, much like the turnip or the radish, very high quality. In this particular instance, in the same field, you can see the rapeseed and the oats were a little higher quality than the last one I showed you. And that was just because they were a little bit later planted, so they weren't quite as mature. But we see that it's really high energy. So putting them together, we did a few trials where we were looking at basically what's the mix we need to get the same yield as an oat monoculture, because the oat monoculture yields very well. And what we found was 50 pounds of oats and 3 pounds of rapeseed would give us the same yield as 100 pounds of oats for late summer planting. And we got a boost in animal performance. And some of you, if you're statistically acute, you're looking at that number going, that's not going to be different, but it is. So we did that over 3 years, and we had enough animals and enough replication that we could pick up that difference. That is consistently an increase in performance. But here's the thing that's a real winner for me. It's cheaper to plant the oats in Nebraska than it was for the oats alone. It was $15 an acre versus $20. Well, that's a win. So I get better performance, same yield, and a lower price. So one of the questions that started coming up as we started doing a bunch of these grazing of these late summer planted annuals was questions about nitrates. I had multiple calls, multiple emails where people had tested their brassicas, they tested their oats, and they came up very high, especially seed corn situations, but also things after corn silage. Even some people who killed out alfalfa early and planted those, and they were seeing high nitrates. And so the question was, how much is too much to graze? We knew there was some differences, but we weren't really sure. One of the first things we did was just kind of go to look and see, well, how high are the brassicas? And this is a very, well, I'll just say there's a lot of stuff on here. The most thing you need to understand is these numbers at the top is basically the percentage of samples that were sent in to Ward Labs from producers across the state that were above 5,000 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. The literature and what you'll read if you look at most extension documents, they say 2,100 parts per million nitrate nitrogen is toxic. So if you look at brassicas, basically almost 50% of the samples were above that threshold. Cover crop mixes, we were somewhere around 28 to 30%, probably because they had brassicas in them. And then as we get into the small grains, millet, and sorghum Sudan, we were somewhere around 20 to 30. And so the question was, does that mean I can't graze 30% of the annuals that I would have been potentially grazing? And the other question was, is the brassicas really the issue, or was it where the brassicas were grown because we couldn't compare them directly? So we actually went and took samples in fields where we had grasses, mostly triticale and oats, planted with the brassicas. And indeed, brassicas are great nitrogen scavengers. That's a wonderful thing, right? From the standpoint of keeping nitrates from leaching through the soil, getting into the groundwater. But it also means that they potentially can accumulate a lot of nitrates. And from a cattle perspective, that might be a negative. So one of the things we actually did is retrospectively, we just went back and we tested the nitrate concentrations in some of the trials that we had been grazing. I had not tested them before. And I'm glad I didn't, because I probably wouldn't have grazed them. I told you 2,100 is what the typical recommendation is. If you look, we had one instance where we were below that. All the rest of them, we were above. And look, this one were 4 times, this one were 3 times, 2 times, and 2 times. I mean, there's no way that if I had known, I probably would have done it. Guess what? Never had a problem. And the calves gained well. And in fact, if you just did a correlation, you would say there was a positive correlation with performance and nitrates. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's true. I think what that means is the quality was probably higher because the plants were less mature, and that's why they had more nitrates. But that started making me wonder what's going on. So one of the fun things we did was dived into the literature. I bet you hear that all the time. One of the fun things we did was dive into the literature. Yes, I am a nerd. So I wanted to kind of explain to you a little bit about what we learned and why I think we can actually go with 5,000 parts per million nitrate nitrogen, and that's probably conservative if we follow some key rules. So the first thing is I got this great diagram on here, and I just want to walk you through it really quickly. So when the animal consumes nitrate, nitrate is not the problem. They consume nitrate. Unfortunately, there is bacteria in the rumen that convert nitrate to nitrite. They're always there. And they are really good at their job. So they're very good at converting nitrate to nitrite. Nitrite's our problem. Nitrite can get, if it builds up in the rumen, it gets absorbed across the rumen wall and into the blood. Unfortunately, nitrite in the blood binds to hemoglobin and makes it unable to carry oxygen. So basically, you have nitrite poisoning, which is the cattle suffocate. So they're just not able to get enough oxygen into their system. Luckily, we also have some bacteria that can convert nitrite to ammonia. There is always some of those guys there, but we can build up their population if we feed them. What do they need to be fed? Nitrite. So we can adapt the bacterial population to more nitrite. The key is we don't want to have this build up, so we want to just be increasing it enough, if that makes sense, to keep these guys to keep up with it. Well, there's a couple other great things, one of which is the rate at which the nitrite users use it has a lot to do with how much energy they have available, because they're using it as a protein source. If you give them more energy, it's just like everything in the soil, it's all about nitrogen-carbon balances. So the great thing is energy helps. What did I show you about those brassicas? They were very high energy, right? So they already have some buffering factor in there because they're high energy. We also have another thing that's really beneficial, and that is the moisture content of the forage. So forages that are fresh release nitrate much more slowly than dried forages. Guess what that 2100 was based off of? It was actually based off of drenching work. So they put the nitrate directly into the rumen. That's the worst case scenario for those nitrite bacteria to be able to keep up, right? So it's probably the most conservative number that we can use. Okay, so the other thing here is rate of intake matters, right? Because we talked about keeping up with the nitrite inflow. So the slower the rate of nitrate inflow, the more buffer we have because those bacteria that are using the nitrite can keep up. So what does that really mean? It means that management is key. So if I put hungry cattle out, guess what's going to happen? They're going to eat a whole bunch rapidly. That's going to be a problem. Grazing is already naturally slower than hay intake, for instance, so that helps us out. But you also want to make sure that you never put out hungry cattle, that if something impedes grazing, say ice, that you make sure that they're full before they get access again. Again, anything you can do, slow down rate of intake. Diet type matters. The fresh forages, much less risk. So if it's dried and standing and you're grazing it, it's going to be higher risk. I'd probably lower that threshold some from that 5,000. Diet quality. If I have brassicas, I'm a little less leery of going a little bit higher because the quality is going to be high. If you're doing something like sorghum Sudan and it's lower quality, it tends to be very low quality when you get it mature and it's still high in nitrate, feed them some grain. That can help you out. And then adaptation. So told you we can build up the right bacteria in the rumen. Well, the cattle already naturally do some adaptation if you allow them to. They are top-down grazers, right? The top of the plant has lower nitrates than the bottom of the plant. So if you allow them to selectively graze, so you don't do high stocking densities, you don't strip graze, you can allow them to slowly increase the amount of nitrates that they're consuming. And so the concentration. Yes, sir.
Eric, this is counterintuitive to me as an agronomist. I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I always thought that you had to like feed some dry hay before you put cattle out on alfalfa, for example.
Okay, so the question was, do we need to be feeding dry hay before we put cattle out onto, you said alfalfa. I assume you're just thinking lush forages? Yeah. So I would say that's one of the things we tell people to do because of this. And with bloat, this is the same kind of idea that you just want the slower rate of intake. But in this situation, actually, you don't want to be causing a lot of fluctuation in intake. So one of the things that's a little bit concerning, like in alfalfa grazing, sometimes we'll say, put them on, let them graze for, say, the afternoon, pull them off, give them hay, then put them back on. That's not what we want to do here. We actually want to continue to have nitrate inflow to keep those bacteria that are reducing nitrite happy, so to speak. So we want to keep them adapted, if that makes sense. And one other thing that we can do is if you have multiple fields and they have different levels of nitrate, start with the lowest and work your way up. So as you graze, you move to the next field, it has more nitrates. They're lower risk because they're adapted.
Right.
Yes, sir.
What's the generation interval of those bacteria?
Great question. So what's the generation interval? So we always joke about the microbiologist in our group. He says that most of the time, like we talk about adaptation to grain-based diets, for instance, he always says we're adapting the cattle, we're not adapting the bacteria. The bacteria multiply very, very rapidly. It's about managing the cattle's intake. In this case, we don't have great numbers on how quickly they change. So we always do the conservative route and we say, do this for 2 weeks. Do I think it takes 2 weeks? No, I don't. Do I have a good number? No, I don't. So a lot of what our suggestions are is to make sure we don't screw up. So I think as most of you in the room, if you've ever done any kind of consulting, you sometimes play it safe. And even the 2100 is playing it really, really safe. I think with high quality forage managed appropriately, I think even 5,000 is safe. I think I'm being conservative there, although there might be some people who would argue with me. If you ever have a problem, right, the first time you make a mistake, you're always going to feel that burn and you're going to want to pull back and be very, very conservative. So I do think there's possibilities of making that suggestion if somebody does all the wrong things and we have a nightmare. But if you understand the parameters and understand what's happening, you can make good decisions. So long story short, I do think current recommendations are too conservative. For our grazing situations, especially fresh, high-quality forage, I think they're on target for dry hay feeding situations. Now, one of the other things we were doing was looking at oat grazing, and I really just wanted to show you this because I wanted to talk just briefly about forage utilization. What we were doing...
Aaron?
Yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt. Again, naive, but it seems like E. coli has the multiplication time of 20 minutes or something. Are these bacteria a lot slower than that in general?
So Charles' question was about E. coli and the generation interval being about 20 minutes. And he was wanting to know, are the nitrite users slower? And I would argue no, but I don't actually know what the number is. And so...
It's an environmental function. Certain conditions exist, bingo,
Yep.
20 minutes. If you don't have those conditions in the critter, it's going to slow down, and so it's a function of environment.
Well, it's like... So it's kind of like the idea, so if you looked at the data where they took rumen fluid, actually this was a really interesting study, but they took rumen fluid from, actually it was sheep, but sheep on a very high quality diet, sheep on a low quality diet. And then they exposed the rumen fluid to nitrate, and they looked at how much nitrite accumulated. And basically they showed the bacteria that had previously been on a high quality diet had half of the nitrate that those that were on low quality. Why? Because they were used to having the higher energy. They probably had higher energy still in the rumen fluid because, you take rumen fluid, it has substrate and everything in there with it. Then they did a study where they just added some glucose. Say, what's going to happen? And again, the bacteria who were used to that high quality diet, they took off. But both increased their ability to take that nitrite and make it into ammonia. So they both responded to the carbon source. And so as you were mentioning, the environment matters. And my guess is the reason why we play it really safe is we don't always know the situation and what the environment is. So great questions. Thank you. And comments. So one of the things we were looking at was the utilization of the forage, and in particular, the amount of grazing we can get, because everybody likes to go out and clip biomass and then say, oh, you can get this many days of grazing. And what we find is that's not the case, that predicting it is very, very difficult because the weather is huge in terms of its impact, especially if you are continuously grazing. As I just told you to do for nitrate management, what we end up doing is in a year where we get some precip events or it's wet when they go out. In 2018, that was the case. It was very wet when we turned out, and I think they trampled in, the majority of the forage. Look at the harvest efficiencies. We went anywhere from 40 down to 13% across 5 years. And as we started looking at the economics, of course, that makes huge differences, right? If we don't get as many head days per acre, things don't look as good. I have on here AUMs per acre. That's basically a 1,000-pound animal for a month. That's what that is. And you can see that it does not correlate with the amount of biomass that was initially out there. So the amount of forage that was out there, you can see 2018 we got very few AUMs per acre, but it wasn't the least biomass that we had. That was actually 2019 when we had double the amount. So one of the things that we started asking was, could we improve the efficiency of grazing by strip grazing? Again, strip grazing was not recommended if it's high nitrates, but if it's not, it might work. So we took oats and rapeseed mix, and we were comparing strip to continuous. Now, what made me really think this could work was that out at US Mark, near Clay Center, they were grazing oats and brassicas, and they were getting about double the AUMs per acre. Well, actually more than double what I was getting. They were moving either once a week or twice a week, and on cows, but they were getting about 60% utilization where I was getting about 30. And so that made me really, really intrigued by the idea and how much money could I make by doing that. So we set up an experiment, and basically we just took a field, we split it up into multiple fields, and then we either continuously grazed those paddocks or we strip grazed them. There's a lot of little groups of cattle out there. So we had about 15 head per group, and we had about 6 groups. But the big thing here is that you see we basically doubled the amount of days we could get per acre. So it fits pretty well with the US Mark data, right? We basically doubled the amount of grazing, actually a little bit more than doubled it. Now, the average daily gain decreases. That makes sense, right? You decrease their ability to select. You maybe limit their intake a little bit. We were trying not to limit it too much. We were shooting for the same amount of ground cover at the end of the 2 systems. But we got a little bit of reduction in individual animal performance, which is probably what I would have hypothesized, but we gained more per acre, which means that economically it still looks pretty good, even when you start charging for the extra labor of moving the strips. And I had a couple pictures I just wanted to show you. So this was in 2020. Does anybody remember what 2020 was like? We had that polar vortex come through in February. So in December, things look pretty good for those strip calves. Then we get into February. Great thing about standing forage is it collects snow, which is really nice, right? If you're trying to capture that precipitation and you want it to actually get into your soil profile. However, as you can see, it basically got up to the level of the oats, which was about 2 feet deep. And then the polar vortex came through, and the crew got a little bit nervous. So, one of the really, really cold days, I can remember I was bundled up as, I can't even imagine, I was probably wearing every piece of clothing in my closet. And I went out to take a look because they were really, really worried. And they even made the call they were going to supplement all the groups. So they supplemented them all with some sweet bran. And I went out and they had just moved the wire for the strips. The continuous had consumed all the sweet bran. It was like within an hour. And the strip guys didn't even look at it. They had got a new strip. They were going to town. Through 2 feet of snow. They didn't care. They were happy as clams. So I thought that was a really interesting observation. Now there's a difference here. One of which is it was snow. It was not ice. Ice makes a huge difference. But white fluffy snow, not a problem for those guys. Now lastly, I'm going to talk about, yes sir.
I guess I would suggest that it makes a big difference how long the time period is on the strip grazing.
Correct.
And I guess I would suggest that if they narrowed the strip and moved it more frequently so that they had fresh feed nearly all the time, that gain would be equal to what you get.
Well, so your comment is that if I move the strips more frequently, I could get even greater performance and equal that of the continuous. So you're probably right from the instance of if I allocated such that I did daily moves, for instance, could I increase the performance? It's possible, but it's really, really difficult to get that balance between intake and trampling losses. So we were looking for a happy medium. I didn't say this, but we moved twice a week. Based off of some of the literature that's out there, not in cover crop grazing, not annual grazing, but in perennial systems, we thought that was a happy medium. Could we decrease or increase the selectivity by offering more or doing it more frequently? Sure, we could. All depends on goals, right? In this case, economically, it still looks darn good. So if you wanted to go out more frequently, although I will argue that if I tell somebody to go out and move about probably 20% would be interested for daily moves and about 80% would look at me like I'm crazy.
Let me follow up on that. The technology is here now so that you could do that essentially electronically.
Okay, so Paul says...
It's not available in Nebraska yet, but it is coming.
So Paul says we're going to have technology that'll allow us to just press a button and get it done.
Well, you can move the fence with your pipe pole.
Yeah, so there's actually, I mean, even like, for instance, the pivot fence system. Actually, U.S. Mark used that and did daily moves on some dry cows on oat brassica mixes. And boy, that worked really slick from the standpoint of you have these cows, they have low requirement, well, let's just restrict how much they can consume. Still, it's not a flip of the switch situation because there's some things they have to move in terms of the end part of the fence, but it's easier than going and pounding posts, which, by the way, I did that. That's not that fun in the winter. But there's other technologies out there. I mean, Gallagher has a wheel, which I actually, I wanted to get before this year, and I did not do it. I don't know why. That can help because then I don't at least have to pound posts. I can just move things. But I think there are opportunities, as you said, to make it easier. Okay, so fall planting is probably the opportunity for more of our producers, right? We can plant, somebody said in the last session, you can plant cereal rye in December and it'll still grow in the spring. Yeah, totally. It's a great opportunity after corn or soybeans. This is actually one of the first trials we did was with Elbon rye. And we were actually looking at the impacts of grazing in the spring on the soil. And so it was a comparison of no rye, rye that's a cover crop only, or rye that we grazed. And the first experience I had with it, I saw 3.2 pound a day gain, and I thought, oh, all the people who've been telling me we can get those types of gains, I had thought they were wrong. I thought it was all a fill thing, because no way will they gain that much. So I thought because they had not controlled for the gut fill, right? I mean, cattle have a big rumen relative to their body size. So if you think about like a cow, it's like 150 pounds they can have in there. If I don't have the same fill going in and coming out, so the same amount in their rumen, I can have huge impacts on gain. These guys we actually manage for fill, so we actually feed them the same diet at the beginning and at the end at the same amount as the limit feeding to avoid that issue. So I was like, wow, that's amazing. I learned some other things with this one, which was you need to turn out way before you think you do. So probably one of the biggest mistakes I see when people think rye is low quality, it's because they let it get away from them. Grazing annuals is not like grazing perennials. They're very, very fast to grow, which means that most of the time you have to stock heavy and you have to be willing to stay on top of it. So this was 3 calves an acre was the stocking rate. And we had a simple back and forth rotation that works really quite well in that system. But the question I kept getting was, well, what if I use something else? So we compared winter wheat and winter triticale to rye. And the first year, the rye actually came on, and we decided our target start was 5 inches. We were going to go out with 3 calves an acre when the grass got 5 inches, and then we had a simple rotation where we were just going back and forth, and we were about doing weekly moves. We were trying to keep it between 2 inches and 8 inches, to tell you the truth. At that rate, it was trying to just keep from going below 2 inches, and sometimes we didn't manage that. But if we look here, we went out on the rye about a week earlier, but we didn't see any difference in performance between the wheat, triticale, and rye. However, in that year, the locations, actually 2 of the 3 fields where the rye was, had some considerable low spots, and we had flooding that put all the soybean residue in some of those locations and actually smothered out our rye. So we ended up having to pull off of our rye a little bit earlier. So we ended up having the same exact number of days of grazing, even though we started earlier. The next year is a different story. The next year, what happened? The triticale and wheat, the gain wasn't nearly as good. Well, I told you 5 inches was our start. Well, the triticale and wheat had a better fall. So they were 5 inches earlier in the spring. So we turned out. We turned out everybody at the same day. And then we had some kind of chilly weather. The rye did better, so it grew more. So we didn't limit intake as much. So that's what you're seeing there. It's about the amount of intake, not about the quality of the forage. The quality was really, really good because we kept it immature. Now, I should point out we had really great gains that first year, 4 pound a day. Those calves had come off stocks. We had only been shooting for 1 pound a day before. Probably 25% of that's compensatory gain, right? So just to be clear, that's probably not what you'd expect if you'd been gaining 1.5 pounds or 2 pounds a day before that. On this one, they were gaining about 1.5 pounds before we turned out. And they are 7 weights, and I will tell you, 700-pound calves, they have a relatively high energy requirement relative to the protein requirement, so it fits pretty well with these forages. Yes, sir?
Question on that in general, I'm sure it's different for each of these trials, but there you listed there were 7 weights. I'm just curious, in a lot of the other numbers
Oh,
you
yep.
gained, were you talking about 5 weights?
I was, yeah. So for the late summer, we typically, for late summer planting, we're grazing in the fall and winter, and they'd be 500 to 600 pound calves. So mostly, spring-born, fall-weaned. And then those 700 pounders are basically those same calves. I mean, not those exact same calves, but the same type of calf, but then grown over the winter, usually on corn stalks with some supplementation. So we're just looking at mostly spring-born calves. I don't have really any grazing work with fall-born calves. So great question. Yeah, I should have told you that. So I did want to show you, this is actually, I don't remember if this is rye or triticale, but this is actually about what it looked like a lot of times when we actually turned back into a field. So it's relatively short. We were staying on top of it. Now, would I recommend quite going that hard? No. I think we went a little bit too hard. Some of the challenges with research is you set a protocol, and I should have had put in takes, and I didn't. So we always learn and make mistakes. Okay, lastly, I really wanted to talk about silage for a second because I think it's a good opportunity, especially if you don't have cattle, but you have a neighbor who does. One of the most interesting experiences I had, I went out where somebody had planted rye after soybeans, and it was 3 inches tall, and we put a soil probe in the ground, and it was 30-inch deep roots. And I thought, wow, the looks can be deceiving. And then I started thinking about, well, if we can continue to let it grow, that'd be amazing. I take off the top growth, that's fine, because not only do I have 2 inches to protect the soil in terms of erosion, but now I got all that biomass below ground. So we started looking at species as well as time of harvest and how that affects quality, because we were starting to get a lot of questions about that. So I'm just going to briefly talk about it. And I'm going to talk about stages of growth, so maturity levels, and I just want everybody to be on the same page. So the first stage I'm going to talk about is boot stage, and basically no heads out. All the heads are just below the flag leaf. So if you see on here, there's actually a little bulge below that first leaf. That's the boot stage. So that's kind of the early stage that we'll be talking about harvesting. And then we have pollination. So all the heads are out, and now we have basically that dusting or that yellow pollen that's out. So that's kind of the next stage. That's an early, an easy one to identify for people. And then milk and soft dough is the other stages that I really wanted to talk about. So milk is, after pollination, you start filling in that seed. But if you go and you pick off a piece of grain and you squeeze it, milky substance will come out. And then if it continues to develop, no longer will you have the milk, but it'll still be doughy, and that's soft dough. So that's just kind of how to think about what I'm talking about with when to harvest. So over the past couple years, we've done trials where we harvested rye, triticale, and wheat. And the one thing we noticed, of course, as it matures, you get more dry matter yield. That's kind of a duh, right? But wheat didn't really hold up as well compared to the rye or triticale, especially at soft dough. And one of the reasons was because what we saw a lot more leaf senescence at soft dough on the wheat. So you saw a lot of browning, yellowing, falling off of leaves. And so I think reason why we didn't get quite as good a yield is we weren't collecting as much of the material that had grown in the wheat. Now there's a lot of varieties and there's a lot of differences in varieties. And to be honest, we just picked some varieties. So take all this with a grain of salt in terms of the comparisons between the species. Looking at energy content, if you harvest at the same stage, we really don't see huge differences. In this case, the triticale was a little bit lower in TDN. And again, I think looking at the yield differences, and maybe that triticale was a little bit higher than the others, even though we were shooting for the same stage, we may have missed it just a little bit on the triticale, and that's why we're seeing that. But in general, they're fairly similar. We see they all kind of tank at milk, and then we get a bump up at soft dough. Anybody know why we get a bump up at soft dough? Grain, yeah. You get some grain filling, so you get some starch. You've lost all of the forage quality already. So now we get a little bit of starch, which is good in terms of the energy content. Crude protein content declines drastically throughout that time period. Look at it at boot. 18% crude protein. That's some good alfalfa right there. I actually have some producers who harvest the small cereals for silage, and they just use it as a protein supplement. That's their protein source. So lower yield, higher protein, higher energy. And we get down to 9% crude protein here at soft dough. That still meets a cow requirement unless she's in early lactation. So very, very good stuff, even that low. We also kind of looked at the timing of when they hit the stages. Our hypothesis was the rye was going to hit everything earlier. The first year that didn't really happen. The rye and the triticale were harvested about the same time. The wheat was behind, and then it actually surpassed the others. In year 2, I got more what I expected, which was the rye was about a week earlier than the others at boot and pollination. And it kind of stuck out. Soft dough was still a little bit earlier. So in general, yeah, the rye in the second year was a little bit earlier. The big thing is that between stages, we're looking at 7 to 10 days. So if you're shooting for a stage, you can very easily miss it. That's probably one of the biggest challenges, right? And so I always tell people, whatever stage you're shooting for, just go a stage earlier and you'll actually hit it the stage you want. Yes, sir?
What were the rough planting dates on those and what years are those?
Okay, so rough planting dates on these was October 15th in both years. And this was 2019 to 2020 was year 1. So planted in 2019, harvested in 2020. And then year 2 was planted in 2020, harvested in 2021. Does that make sense? And I was trying to remember, actually, this year, that's in that grazing trial, that second year of the grazing trial, that was where the rye, the triticale, and the wheat were all the same for when we turned out on grazing. They were planted on a different date. I think the grazing trial was planted the 1st of October, if I remember correctly. So my conclusion is rye or triticale results in the best nutrient yield per acre. But I did put up here the caution about varieties. I think there's just as much difference in varieties as there is even between species. And this is just a picture to illustrate that. This was Elbon rye versus a variety non-stated. So I don't know what it is. Probably a northern rye, just looking at the difference between the two, planted in the same field at the same time. And the Elbon rye is a southern rye. It tends to come out of dormancy earlier, tends to mature a little bit more quickly then. And so it yields a little bit greater at the same time because it hits a different stage. So you can see it's actually headed where the other one hasn't reached through boot yet. So my point here is that I don't know that saying one species is superior to another is completely true, because I do think there's huge differences among varieties. We need some good variety trials for silage. But I did want to talk in generalities about harvest timing. And so what I did is I just put the TDN, which is in red, and then the crude protein concentrations to remind you what that looks like. So probably if you're wanting high quality, right, really high quality, boot makes sense. But you don't lose a lot in terms of energy going to pollination, and we gain quite a bit of yield. So pollination may look better, and I'll show you that in just a second. The other thing to point out is, depending on the type of animal and what their needs are, you might change your harvest timing based off of the crude protein content. But if we look at nutrient yield per acre, you see that the TDN increases from boot all the way to soft dough. So if you were looking at getting the most energy per acre, soft dough looks really, really good. And a lot of people harvest in the soft dough, especially if they're going to be using it in combination with some grain resource like for finishing cattle. But the other thing I wanted to point out is look at the crude protein content. It actually did not change by stage in terms of yield of crude protein. What does that really mean? Early on, that plant pulled up all the nitrogen it could, and then it's just diluting it out with more growth, right? So we're not actually pulling off more nitrogen going to later stages, which I thought is actually kind of interesting. So it's just changing the distribution relative to the amount of dry matter. So for higher quality forage, if I'm looking at beef animals, I'm probably going to go pollination. We get the increased yield without a huge deficit in TDN. And just looking at that, you see we're going from 400 to basically, 4,000 to basically 5,500 pounds of TDN. That's a huge boost. And then for maximizing TDN yield, soft dough makes sense. Caution about soft dough. You can easily miss soft dough and get to hard dough, and it's not wet enough. So that's a problem. There's another problem, which is we worked with 20 producers. Gary sampled a bunch of them for us. Appreciate that, Gary. And we were looking at, well, what's the quality and what's the management that they're using for small cereals. And the one thing I wanted to show you was that 40% of the samples, as they were putting them into the silo, was too wet. They did not wilt long enough. And the consequence of that is that they end up losing a lot of the feed value because the fermentation is not optimal. So I have on here which is the gray bars. So that's basically what the TDN content was when they were putting it into the silo. And then post is what it was when they were taking it out of the silo. So the difference, the gap, which basically means what you can see of the gray bar, is how much energy they lost during that fermentation. And then I have some stars up here, and the stars are basically telling you that not only were those samples too wet, but we actually measured butyric acid in those samples. Butyric acid is a clear sign that we have the wrong time of fermentation going on. We actually have Clostridial bacteria. Not only does butyric acid make it unpalatable or less palatable, but it can also have some negative consequences in that those bacteria themselves can actually cause disease in cattle. So we don't really want a lot of that. Now, a little bit, we don't want a little bit either. Actually, we want none. But a lot of people get away with it because they feed that amount at very, very low levels, like in the feedlot situations. But I did want to show you, look at this one. This one went from something that was almost 60 TDN, really good quality, to 40. That's less than straw. So the idea that I was trying to remember, I think half of the samples were rye, about 30% were triticale, and then we had some oats and some barley. My point here being that people have this idea that rye is low quality, all about management. It's all about management. So in this case, I think if you're trying to make silage, paying attention, making sure you wilt it, get that moisture down. And interestingly, like in our sampling, when we were cutting soft dough, our samples were just about at the right moisture to direct cut. But there was at least 8 of these samples that were soft dough when they cut them, and they were still too wet. So I don't think you can use stage as an indicator, which I think is kind of interesting. All right, so last thing here is just, if you're really interested in silage, we have some of the nation's experts coming in to talk about small grain silages on March 17th. So if you really have an interest, you can learn from people who know a whole lot more than I do. And in particular, I'm really excited about, we have somebody coming in to talk about inoculants. He is the world expert on inoculants. So if you're interested, you can use that QR code right there, and or you can look it up online, small grain silage. And then it's free. You can attend virtually, or you can attend in person, and it is at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center. And we also have a panel that has a couple producers and a couple nutritionists, which should be really interesting as well. Okay, so any more questions? We're almost on time here. Charles,
Yeah, it's Chuck.
Chuck, sorry.
I wonder if you would speculate a little bit beyond your data for a weird kind of question. You talked about strip grazing versus continuous, which is like rotational grazing, it's of course more efficient and all that, but there's problem moving fences and all that. You also talked about mixtures of species play across the landscape, which is good for environmental and all that kind of stuff. What if you were to alternate strips of brassica and a small grain, and then continuously graze that? Would cattle instinctively select a good mixture of the two, or would they eat the candy first? What would they do?
Okay, so the question was if I alternated strips of a brassica and say grass, and then I continuously grazed it, would they make a good diet, so to speak? Would they select? And that's a really good question. I do think that we do see, for instance, if we have brassicas like this year, did anybody have armyworm problems? We had armyworm problems in our oats. And we had some fields that had brassicas and oats in them, and then they had brassicas in them. There was no oats. So one of the things that we noticed is that when we put cattle out on there, we actually gave them access to hay, which I was a little bit like, I don't know what they'll do. But the calves actually ate quite a bit of the hay and supplemented the brassicas. So I don't know the answer to that question. I see when we have oats and brassicas together, depends on when we start grazing, on what they actually select first. Seems like they don't like the brassicas until after the frost, and then they really start eating them. And I don't know if it's something about changes, and there are some anti-quality factors or some sulfur-containing compounds. I don't know if that changes, if some of that disappears. We don't see huge differences in sulfur, so I really don't know why, but it seems like it gets sweeter or something. They do seem to eat it better later. So that's my speculation is, I really can't speculate. I would guess that they wouldn't do, how do I put this? That they would probably end up selecting a lot of the brassica, but they already do that. Like when we continuous graze, if we go and sample every 2 weeks, we see the proportion that's brassica basically exponentially decrease. They select it out after the frost. They just start going to town on it. So I guess they do that still. They just have an easier time of doing it because they could just hang out in that one spot until they get it done. Now, I will say we decided to go ahead and try with a much more diverse mix, and actually had warm seasons in it, and had proso millet, it had sunflower, and try the comparison of the strip grazing to the continuous. In this case, there was a lot more lower quality forage. The oats and the rapeseeds, both very high quality and both very palatable. In this case, there was stuff that they didn't really want to eat. And I was really intrigued to see what would happen in terms of selectivity and what's going to happen in performance. Those cattle just got pulled, so I don't know what's going to happen in performance. But there's some observations, one of which is there was proso millet out there, and it was really fun to see the cattle figured out proso millet. They liked those heads, and they would go through and select them, and they loved the sunflower heads. So the calves figured out very, very quickly the sunflower heads and the continuous disappeared in the first week. And then in the strips, that's the first thing they started going after as soon as you gave them a new strip. And then the other thing is we saw those proso heads. There's a lot of proso millet in the feces. So I actually wanted to do starch to see how much they actually used. But I'm going to be really intrigued because selectivity will be much more important in that system. I will say it was much harder to manage, like how much in the strip grazing, how much we gave them. And I would say we probably ended up being less tight, and we gave them a little bit more ability to be selective. So I suspect the difference in performance is going to be smaller, but I could be wrong. Yes, sir.
I guess I would suggest that some of the work that Fred prevents is something that might influence this, and that would be generally if these calves had faced this situation when they were with their mothers, and if they had not, and if they had, I
Yeah, so Paul's comment was basically, Fred Provenza, he's done work looking at learned behavior, basically. And like, for instance, Fred did some work with sheep where he taught the mom that alfalfa was not good, right? That every time they ate alfalfa, he would dose them and make them sick. And the mom would teach the baby, don't eat alfalfa, because it would never select it, so the baby wouldn't select it. So you could actually train them to select something. And so his comment was selectivity may differ depending on the previous experience of the animal or even what the mom had experienced, right? And in this case, all this stuff was likely novel to all of our calves. So they had to kind of figure it out on their own. And it's the same thing with Nebraskas. I think like we see with cows, that selectivity thing where after the frost, we see them eat more earlier because they've experienced it before and they know what it is. But the calves, it's pretty much consistent. Like they won't touch it until after the frost. And I don't know if it's just that it takes that time for them to figure it out, or if there is something about the frost, because otherwise I would suspect it's not always the same timing. So I think it has something to do with the frost, but I could be wrong about that. It's just an observation. But you're totally right that we can train animals to be different in terms of what they select. Okay, I think...
This question was not really frivolous because as agroecologists, we're looking for ways to design systems based on your kinds of observations and natural systems. How can we design those to be really productive and minimize labor and management and all that too at the same time? So I think your experiential stuff in the field of just observing animals is just as valuable as the external data for designing the next kinds of experiments.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes, so I think going out and observing what's happening is really important to thinking about what the potential impacts might be. And so I always like things like in our experiments, I'll take, days and say, I'll go do the sampling or I'll go move the fence. And the big reason I do it is because I just want to go see things. I want to go observe and I want to think. And it's actually kind of funny. Sometimes I'm out there and some other students will show up and they'll be like, what happened? You didn't have anybody to help today? And I was like, no, I just wanted to see what's going on. Because a lot of times the data is only telling you part of the story, right? You didn't collect everything. So observations are important. Now, as a scientist, observations can be used to develop a hypothesis, but then we got to test it, right? So I very much enjoy going out and observing, and some things are testable and some things aren't, but I like to learn that way. It's the same way with, conversations with producers. They observe things and then some of those are testable and it's kind of fun. Well, I appreciate your time, and I'm sure if we have other questions, you can catch me before we end here today. Mary, we good? All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.